Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. This is part 1 of What If Naruto Stuck in Time Loop. If you guys enjoyed this what if, then comment, like and subscribe. Let's go. Also, the video goal is 10 likes. So, let me know that you're interested in the series and you want the next part. Then go ahead and check out the other what ifs in the channel. Before we start, please do support for more awesome content. Don't forget to subscribe and also share the video with your friends and link in the description. So, let's go. Nothing post-time skip applies. It never happened, it will never happen, and the junk Bakumoto made up about rules of how this or that work do not apply. Kishimoto started with a good concept, then turned his own series into crap. It makes me wonder if he knows rolling on a social basis. It was the worst day for Konoha since the Kyuubi attack, the invasion by the hidden villages of Sand and Sound. Everything was chaos. Caught off guard and admittedly soft from years of peace, the people of Konoha were unprepared to be stabbed in the back by an allied village, or for the destructive return of one of their most powerful missing ninja, arriving at the head of a new band of followers. Into this opening, Orochimaru stabbed, gutting the village that was once his home, using his own sound shinobi and deceived sand ninja to sow destruction and chaos among his former friends and neighbors. Death and destruction was everywhere. It wasn't quite the end of the village hidden among the leaves. They would, in the normal course of events, throw off the attack and survive. But they would be weakened for some time to come, losing precious prestige and influence that cost them almost as dearly as the defending ninja who died that day. But something happened Orochimaru did not intend. While he was attacking his former teacher, intending to kill Sarutobi, the Hokage of Konoha, a young boy sheathed in the red aura of the Kyuubi attacked the barrier his faithful Sound 4 had erected around the two to isolate their epic battle. Thus begins our story. Naruto groaned, turning over in bed. The whiskered blonde boy blinked twice, coming more awake as he realized something. The last thing he remembered was charging at that wall of blue light, whatever it was, trying to get to the old man, to save him from whatever that long-necked guy was doing. He remembered hitting that screen, and then, nothing, just waking up here. Surprisingly, the young boy did not feel as awful as he somehow expected to. His body was fine, although his mind was decidedly not. There was an odd mix in there of the afterimage of the worst headache of his life, and a strange sort of tiredness, just like he was exhausted after a hard day, ready for a full night of sleep instead of getting up from one. So, deciding that since no one would need him for anything after the fight the other day he could get away with taking a sick day, he rolled over and went right back to sleep, so tired that he didn't even pause to wonder about how the old man Hokage did in that fight the boy had tried interrupting. A few hours later his nap got interrupted, first by loud banging on his door, which he ignored by rolling over, then Naruto. Sakura slammed open his unlocked door. The lock was broken. Like almost everything else in the boy's run-down apartment, eyes wild with rage and her aura actually visible, so lost to her temper that she actually looked more like inner Sakura for once. Before the boy had a chance to sit up, blink, and wipe at the corner of his eye mumbling a puzzled, Sakura-chan. His teammate had stormed into the apartment and turned over his bed, flipping him out onto the ground in a pile of not-so-clean blankets and sheets. He got as far as blinking, sitting up from his new position, and muttering a puzzled, "Saku," before the pink demon of fury had hauled him to his feet by the front of his nightclothes and was shouting into his face. "Just what did you think you were doing, sleeping in today of all days?" Waking up at last, the demon container wiped his eyes, unperturbed by her anger. Sakura was always angry at him, though today she seemed more than usual. "Oi, Sakura-chan," he mumbled into her glazed fury. "Did I miss something? You made us miss out on entering the Chunin exams." She shrieked into his face, shaking him feebly. As the rage-induced adrenaline left her weak limbs she dropped her hold on the boy's clothes. Mortified, the Kyuubi container saw tear tracks coming down from her eyes as Sakura teared up once more. Sasuke-kun was so disappointed. Naruto bounced back to his feet again. "Oi, Sakura-cha." She pierced him with a gaze of pure, unadulterated hatred, stopping his attempt at apology and request for what she was talking about in its tracks. "Don't you ever call me that again, Uzumaki Baka." The preteen girl shouted in his face, tears flying as she mixed both grief and anger. "In fact, don't ever speak to me again." And with that, she fled crying from his room and his house, leaving the young boy in total puzzlement over her behavior, while her inner Sakura was doing flips and handstands over how much her Sasuke-kun would appreciate her punishing Naruto Baka for disappointing them. Head still aching and still tired, though not as much, but no longer disposed to sleep, Naruto started puzzling over her inexplicable behavior while he went about his morning routine. He was just coming out of the shower, having come up with no answers nor anything he'd done to upset her lately, when he stepped out, wearing a towel, only to see Sasuke standing there in his hallway, glaring at him in rage. Ignoring the anger as he always did, Naruto raised a hand and greeted his teammate happily. "Oi, Sasuke-tem, what's up?" His answer came in the form of one of the best right hooks the last Uchiha had ever thrown. Not even remotely expecting it, Naruto put up no resistance when his fellow member of Team 7 beat him to within an inch of his life. The loudmouthed blonde boy had never been subject to so much violence from this boy, who he'd often considered a friend, even a brother, and caught between his initial surprise and trying to keep his towel on, didn't put up too much of a fight. Finally, the brooding Avenger wore his arms out and left without once having said a word the entire visit, his knuckles split and bleeding, toes sore from too much kicking, and annoyed that Naruto had absorbed it all without dying. Naruto was left laying there on his floor in shock. Oh, the cuts and bruises went away so quickly he'd been healed of some before the others had fallen, but the shock of the brutality of the attack had left him astonished, and he lay there coming to grips with it. Sasuke-tem had done everything sort of drawing weapons or using jutsu on him. He'd never once seen him that angry. And Sakura-chan, too. What was up with them? What had he missed by sleeping in one day? Glancing at a clock, the village pariah rubbed at sores on the back of his head in confusion. Heck, Kakashi-sensei shouldn't even be to the group's regular meeting spot yet. What could have gotten them so upset? As if to answer his unspoken question, the rookie genin turned around and saw their teacher there, leaning against a wall in Naruto's hallway, his nose stuck deep in that orange-covered book he always carried. "Oi, Kakashi-sensei." The battered blonde dove forward, scrambling closer on his hands and knees, trying to get some answers, only to be stopped by a hostile gaze once again. There was anger there, but mostly disappointment. Through there was also some disgust, which, while Naruto was used to being ignored by his teacher, having his sensei be disgusted by him was a whole new realm of hurt. Kakashi snapped his book shut, uncoiling slowly to face his blue-eyed student. "Naruto, you greatly disappointed your team today. I'd thought better of you. For a while I thought you understood how your role is to support your teammates. I was counting on you to be there to hold them together, so Sasuke could climb higher. Now you have failed when they needed you the most, and I can see that I made a mistake in letting you graduate." And with that the Jonin vanished in a swirl of leaves. The much-abused Naruto was nearly in tears from these repeated shocks, coming one after another. Suddenly he couldn't bear to be in his apartment anymore. It was the source of too much recent pain. Throwing on his clothes over still healing bruised flesh, he got out of there and began to walk around the city aimlessly, no real purpose or place to go. It was a bright, sunny day outside, one filled with many happy people. With the many visitors to town here for the Chunin exam, more crowds were out than usual to see the strange new faces and wonder at their guests. It was a happy town, a joyful one, well, when Naruto wasn't around anyway. He still got hateful glares wherever he went, but more importantly, it was a peaceful town. Even Naruto started to notice changes right away, but he couldn't put his finger on what it was he was noticing until he came upon one of the ninja he'd seen killed. It was a Konoha nin, and Naruto knew nothing about him, not even his name. They were not even acquaintances, however, he had seen the man die in gory and messy ways, then his body laying slumped on the ground. It had been a particularly graphic and unmistakable death, even for ninja. It was for that reason that it had stood out among so many, and a big part of why he'd remembered it. Startled by seeing that man alive, Naruto started looking around and saw that none of the other damage was visible. That had been a tremendous fight that had brought Konoha to its knees. The battle had scarred the entire town as jutsu-wielding ninja fought across the whole length and breadth of it, yet everything looked just fine. If there had been a battle here, there certainly was no trace of it. But how could that be? He'd been there during that battle, he knew it had happened. Naruto puzzled till his puzzler was sore, but he could not make any sense of it. He knew that those things had happened, but All of those thoughts fled his mind as he dismissed them, having seen a person who could probably tell him what was up with Sakura-chan. "Oi, Ino, wait up." And the orange-clad boy ran over to where the blonde girl had been walking along proudly with her team. Fresh from the tests, and flush with their own success, Ino turned to face her caller simply radiating confidence, at least until she recognized who it was. Then a thin layer of anger overlaid her confidence. "Naruto," she snapped, before the boy could get a word in edgewise. "How dare you show your face after disappointing Sasuke-kun that way?" The boy scraped to a halt and rubbed his cheek. "Ino, what are you talking about?" She rolled her eyes. "Today was the first test of the Chunin exam, moron. Did you just forget to show up? Sasuke-kun wasn't able to take the test since his whole team wasn't there to support him. You are holding him back. HMPH. Maybe he should find himself another teammate, or a better team." Ino turned her nose up, gave a disdainful sniff, and turned away, walking off with Team 10 trailing along in her wake. Naruto just stood there, looking gobsmacked. "But, wasn't that a month ago?" he mumbled. Now Konoha's pariah had long ago developed an iron-hard skull, bull-headed determination being his sole survival tool in a village that hated him. Having been sabotaged by teachers and scorned by all who knew him, he had learned to dismiss anything he could not understand, as there was no person he could go to regularly to explain them or help him figure them out, and all too many people who'd be willing to deliberately add to his confusion. So, since most puzzles had no solution, at least to him, he'd learned to simply throw them out so he didn't waste any mental effort worrying about them. Still, as much as he tried to, today's events were a bit of a strain for him to just pass off as nothing. So it was that Naruto found his feet guiding him to the one place he could always count on for help explaining things he couldn't understand. The Hokage could not spare time to teach him all of the time, but he was the kid's one source of trustworthy information on things he couldn't otherwise understand, the only one before graduation who'd ever explained things to him. So he tromped into the Hokage's office and shot an arm up high. "Oi, old man, how did your fight with Snake Face go? I didn't see the end of it." Sarutobi took his pipe out of his mouth and stared at the boy in confusion. He'd been expecting Naruto to begin pleading and whining over his failure at the Chunin entrance exam, not this. He'd already prepared a speech where he denied the boy a second chance to take this test, telling him how another 6-month wait would build his skills and character. Instead, Naruto seemed not to care at all. Then his question hit. "I'm sorry, Naruto. I've not seen Orochimaru in many years." The Hokage tapped ash out of his pipe in confusion over how that question had come out of the boy's mouth. "Huh." Naruto opened his eyes wide to blink in confusion of his own, then he stamped a foot down hard, forming a fist. "Don't lie to me, old man. I saw you fighting him yesterday. He was there, all wiggly and with that long neck thing of his. You'd gotten trapped in this big, blue box and he'd gotten these guys growing trees and stuff inside while you summoned a monkey." Laying the pipe aside, Sarutobi carefully looked over the youngster. "I'm sorry, Naruto. But I do not use my summons lightly, and there are no publicly known users of the wood techniques who remain in Konoha. The last was our first Hokage. So I would have known of any such goings-on. You must have heard stories before having quite an interesting dream. Could it all have been just a dream?" The boy wondered, scratching his head. Then his eyes widened in horror. "But that means I missed my chance to become a Chunin. Ah, what a day to sleep in." Sarutobi chuckled. "Don't take it so hard, Naruto. In another 6 months you may get another chance. You are still young, there are many opportunities before you. I'll tell you what." He took out a slip of paper and began to write a note. "Take this to Ebisu, he is a special Jonin who teaches only the best. This will instruct him to teach you a jutsu." Numbly, Naruto accepted the paper and the accompanying instructions on how to find the special Jonin, then went off to find him. Having already objected once to this instructor, then failed to win in a contest in support of those objections, Naruto did not complain about having Ebisu as a teacher. They had begun the water walking training together, which had turned out to be useful. Besides, the boy's mind was numb from repeated shocks, so for once he simply did as he was told and sought out the older man. Sarutobi, watching in his crystal ball, was shocked by this behavior. Meek acceptance was not often a part of Naruto's character. So the Hokage supposed having lost his chance at the Chunin exam had hurt the boy worse than he'd thought. The demon container tracked down his new teacher in the forests around the training grounds, spending some time doing so as he had to find exactly where he was. There, he simply presented the note, and proceeded to stand there obeying wordlessly as Ebisu instructed him to do this, do that, lift one foot, assume taijutsu stances, and then finally list off the jutsus he already knew. Body switch, transformation, sexy, shadow clone, harem techniques, the boy replied woodenly, still in shock over it all, and forgetting to put toad summoning on his list. Ebisu sniffed disdainfully. 2 of those are useless, and the others are all basic, except for the shadow clone technique. You do not even say you have the basic clone technique, so you fail to master the essential 3. Still, the man pushed his small glasses back up his nose as he gazed off to the horizon proudly. I suppose shadow clone makes up the difference enough for you to be considered a rookie genin. But you are nowhere close to being Chunin material. Yeah, just teach me something, already. Naruto started to pick his nose, staring at the instructor sullenly, already tired of being yelled at. He'd already had enough of that for one day. Ebisu crossed his arms and gave him a dismissive snort. Harumph. Go walk up that tree. He pointed. Naruto did so. Hey, your chakra control is pathetic. Go walk on that stream. Ebisu ordered, pointing again. Naruto did so. Wasteful. You use 100 times the chakra that you need. Float that leaf above your palm. The special Jonin ordered. What are you talking about? The sullen genin groused. Smiling that he had found something easy to teach the young boy, Ebisu then started to explain the leaf floating exercise for training in chakra control, which he left Naruto to perform for the rest of that day. Late evening, finishing off with a dinner consisting of an enormous amount of ramen, the village pariah concluded what had on the whole been a very stressful and unproductive day, and went back to bed with most of his questions still unresolved, already long into the process of forgetting them altogether. Waking up early the next morning, Naruto blearily went through his ordinary routine before heading out to the forest to continue his training with the leaf floating thing. He'd been at it several hours, without much success, when all of a sudden he was lifted up by the throat by an angry Sakura who was practically breathing flames as she shouted, "Naruto! Just what did you think you were doing, goofing off today of all days?" Huh, wah, Sakura-cha, his head was suddenly ringing as she'd just dropped and slapped him. Don't you ever call me that again, Uzumaki Baka, she shouted. In fact, don't ever speak to me again. You made us miss out on entering the Chunin exams. But, I thought that was yesterday, he puzzled, already confused as the half-dismissed questions from yesterday returned, full force, to his mind. Sakura just slapped him again as her answer, before stomping off, sure of the justice in her righteous fury, and that Sasuke-kun would be so happy that she'd helped punish Naruto for disappointing them like that. The blonde boy she'd left behind just stared after her in confusion, clutching the hand-shaped red mark on his cheek. Moments later, turning to face another sound he'd only just heard, the confused blonde called out, "Oi, Sasuke-tem, what's up?" This time the right hook wasn't entirely unexpected. When Kakashi came and broke up their fight, he gave Naruto a silent yet withering glare, then took the last Uchiha away for private training. Naruto stumbled into town in a daze, found Ino with her team where he'd last met her, received the exact same treatment and response, and wandered in even more confusion up to the Hokage's office, where Sarutobi once more took pity on the boy and gave him a note for Ebisu. The special Jonin was able to give him several pointers on his leaf floating technique, and after another day of training Naruto went to bed one very confused boy. Oi, Saku, Haruno-san, Naruto called out weakly, giving a half-hearted wave to his pink-haired teammate as she came skipping up to greet Sasuke. Sakura gave him a look filled with confusion that he'd switch from his usual intimate form of address to something so formal, but quickly figuring that if he was going to stop bothering her with his clumsy and unwanted crush, that was all to the good as it made it clearer to Sasuke-kun that he had no rivals for her affection. The pink-haired Kunoichi accepted the change in address and went to babble to her other teammate, leaving Naruto out in the cold, so to speak. The boy she was ignoring felt so confused he didn't know where to start. He felt burned enough by the one bad experience to not want to sleep in, and just confused enough by the other to check in at the testing center before he went off to train, and to his surprise, all of the Chunin hopefuls were gathering for a chance to take the first test. Naruto had a deeply ingrained aversion to thinking. Thinking about why the villagers hated him only made it hurt more. Thinking about problems when no one would ever give him an answer just got him more confused. But here was something he could not ignore, and it was driving him crazy. Happy to dismiss it all in spite of that, the blonde boy followed his two other teammates into the building, where there was a group of disguised Chunins standing by a door under an illusion, trying to turn the test hopefuls away. The boy watched, awestruck, as the fight between Lee and Sasuke happened once more, exactly as before, as the bushy-browed boy tried again for the first time. To prove that hard work could beat a genius. The Uzumaki boy followed in an ever-increasing stupor as events turned out the same as before until they reached the testing room. This time he was in far too much of a haze to call out his challenge to the room, but still the silver-haired, glasses-wearing Konoha genin came up to offer them advice, and the rush attack from the sound genin happened just as before, with Naruto staring at it all as a dumbstruck witness, too shocked to move. By the time Ibiki came out and they all had the exact same seats as before, the demon container could no longer stand it. Standing up on his chair and placing one foot on his desk, he pointed to the head examiner and shouted, "You bastard. Nobody has to write down anything to pass this test. You've got it rigged so that anyone who agrees to take the 10th question wins." Ibiki, while both surprised and fuming inside, kept a calm facade as he looked down on his notebook and shouted a terse, "Team 7 fail." Naruto was still staring dumbly as the assistant examiners took him by the arms, dragged him to the doors, and threw him out. He was barely listening as Sakura shrieked, almost blowing out his eardrums, that if he'd learned something secret about the tests he should have kept quiet about it and not gotten them thrown out. Sasuke bruised his feet and hurt his knuckles trying to give his unresponsive rival another beating. Kakashi let it happen. Then he had a few words to say, adding his own lecture about keeping secret information secret so you could use it to your advantage, and not blurting it out in public so it couldn't do you any good. Still, at least this time Kakashi was a bit amused. On top of his anger at Naruto for getting his team thrown out of the exams. Naruto was still gulping like a goldfish by the time they left him alone. "Everything," he finally whispered, long after he was all alone. "Everything is the same, nothing changes." Then he grew a wide, prankster grin, and his eyes came alight for the first time in days. "Unless I change it." He went off to see the Hokage and, sure enough, after trying and failing to explain what was going on to the one man he trusted most of all, he got another letter to Ebisu, who further refined his leaf floating technique with a few more helpful suggestions. With help like this he'd soon get it down. The boy was chuckling madly as he went back to sleep. Oi, Sakura-chan," Naruto called out happily, greeting his team in a new morning while standing in front of the testing center as all of the Chunin hopefuls entered. His hair was washed and he had on his best outfit. "Glad to see you decided to come." "Well, I wasn't about to disappoint Sasuke-kun," the pink-haired fangirl cried, rushing over to the object of her obsession to fawn over the brooding Uchiha. At first Naruto frowned, as that snub had hurt. Then he quickly smiled again, rubbing the back of his head while chuckling, before adopting a very obvious sly expression. "Say, Sakura-chan, why do you like Sasuke so much?" Why? Sakura shrieked, before bonking the blonde on the head. "Why do you have to ask such a stupid question? He's a strong ninja, the top of his class. You think I'd go for a dead last like you when I could have someone like him?" Suddenly she was back by the Uchiha's side, trying to take his arm so she could guide him into the center. "Come along Sasuke-kun, we wouldn't want to be late for the test." Grumbling and rubbing his head, Naruto followed them inside. Naruto was often a study in opposites. Though he could be dense at times, he was also capable of feats of amazing brilliance. The chief difference was the amount of encouragement he got. At the Ninja Academy his teachers had outright sabotaged his progress. The village shops sold him the worst quality gear for premium prices, and in all other ways did their level best to hinder his progress. On the other hand, the one time he'd felt a teacher was going out of his way to help him, Naruto had performed the mission he'd asked of him flawlessly, and learned a Jonin-level jutsu in a matter of hours. When he'd thought his team was counting on him, he'd participated substantially in the defeat of an A- rank missing ninja. He'd learned water walking in spite of having Orochimaru's extra seal messing up his already pathetic chakra control, and it was like magic. When people believed in him, he performed. It was that simple. He'd learn at rates the legendary Sannin couldn't believe, if only someone would give him a chance and a little bit of direction. And right now he was bored, sitting through the written test portion of the Chunin exam. The head examiner was trying to pour on the pressure, but Naruto already knew the secret of this test: anyone who agreed to take the final question won. So why bother stressing about the other answers? On the other hand, Hinata, the girl who sat to his right, was fretting visibly over his complete lack of concern for doing any work on the problems on the paper. Having already finished herself, her bloodline having gotten all of the answers for her, once again she whispered, "Naruto-kun, you can copy mine," and slid her paper discreetly over to help him read her answers. The blonde in question blinked at the ordinarily shy girl, stuttering out her offer to let him cheat, using her exam as an answer key. He relaxed as it struck him this was the second time she'd made that offer. He'd only turned down the first because he could sense one of the test proctors had noticed. Taking his feet off of the desk, where he'd been kicking back, loafing around, waiting for the test to be over, the boy leaned forward and whispered back. He glanced down at her paper and read off her name, Hinata-chan. Why would you do something like that? The girl blushed, cringing slightly away from him as she answered his question. Nah, Naruto-kun, she stammered, the test, it is important that you pass it. Team 7 fail. Team 8 fail. One of the proctors called off, and to his surprise Naruto found himself once more ushered out of the building, this time with his angry team accompanied by Hinata and hers, as well, although the latter seemed more confused about how they had been caught than angry. They were experts at information gathering, and had that whole test in the bag, every one of them. That was, Kiba and Shino, Hinata's teammates, were confused until Sakura started to yell at Naruto for whispering to Hinata during a monitored test and getting them all thrown out. That was worth some angry grumbling from Kiba and a very stiff stance from Shino, while Hinata blushed and rubbed her fingers together in the shame of it all. Naruto felt bad for the girl, so after Sasuke's attempts to plaster him were broken up by Kakashi, he went off to find her, but Hinata and her team had disappeared somewhere. Nothing left to do, Naruto went for another visit to the old man, and got another letter to Ebisu, where the special Jonin gave him a few more tips on the leaf floating exercise, and a comment about how he wasn't as lackluster as the teacher had suspected, given what he'd already heard of him. Another full day training on chakra control, and it was off to bed for Naruto. Two more repeats of that day had Hinata offering to help him each time. It was driving Naruto to distraction, as he'd finally noticed how much it upset the girl to see him not filling in those blanks. The thing was, she actually seemed to care about him passing the test. One of those contrasts about Naruto was that, while he could be a surprising blockhead and amazingly unobservant at times, at others he could also switch that around and notice things that no one else did, like his pointing out that Lee had bandages over his hands not as a fashion statement, but because his knuckles were split and sore from constant training, something that neither of his teammates had picked up on at the time. Now, stuck in this time loop, it was easy to focus in on small things. Heck, he could hardly help but do so. Since his efforts to get Sakura to divulge the secret as to why she thought Sasuke was so awesome were turning up nothing useful, he was beginning to notice other things. In the stress of his first time through this test, he'd not paid too much attention to Hinata's offer of help, and afterward he'd almost forgotten about it completely in the flush of success at passing. However, out of her repeated attempts to help, and his total lack of stress, knowing he did not need it to pass, caused him to become fully aware of something. She genuinely seemed to want to help. There were maybe 3 others who'd ever just wanted to help him for the sake of helping him. And what's more, he could see the girl suffering as she did so. This mattered to her. Why? He had no idea, but this was the 3rd time in a row now, and he figured it was not some trifling detail. Actually, his eyes teared up as her genuine offer of help finally penetrated as a real attempt to help him. This was not some random Konoha ninja assisting another in need, she wanted to help him. The dead last of the academy, the hated Uzumaki, the demon container. Of the 9-tailed demon fox, him. He actually wept out loud and got them all thrown out again. The next day Naruto skipped out on greeting Sakura, giving her a brief wave as he sought for the shy girl who kept giving up her own chance at success to help him. Not finding her at once, he decided to throw caution to the wind and blitzed the whole area with shadow clones, hundreds of copies of himself going all over until they spotted the distinctive shy girl, who'd already gone past him and into the building. Sprinting to catch up to her so he could speak to her before the test and tell her not to worry, his clones got caught up in among the other genin and lost her. That led to a scuffle that nearly got him thrown out before the test, and Sakura only dragged him in at the last minute by his ear, ending up out of the place he'd always used in the line to receive seat numbers, and he wasn't even next to Hinata that time. Thinking he had it made, the orange-clad genin kicked back, put his feet up, and waited out the test, only to have Sakura opt out when Ibiki called for those who didn't want to take the 10th question. Naruto slapped himself in the face, having forgotten how stressed they'd all been that first time. He'd forgotten all about how Sakura had nearly dropped them all out so she could save his dream of being Hokage. Sasuke was coldly furious with the girl, saying some very hard and harsh things that probably ruined her dreams forever, except that she would recall none of it tomorrow. Naruto felt terrible about it all. Sighing, he left to go see the Hokage, got his letter, and went to meet Ebisu, no longer having to look around for him, going right to where the man was. After 5 days of studying that leaf-floating thing with Ebisu, the special Jonin had actually unknowingly passed him off on that, concluding that of the 3 basic chakra control exercises, leaf floating, tree climbing and water walking, his tree walking was the worst, and giving him some hints as to how to do it better, he'd left him to practice those all day, because the outcast youth needed better chakra control more than anyone. Ebisu was still haranguing Naruto that his basics were all out of whack. Of course, the special Jonin had no idea that he'd been giving him that speech day after day for most of a week now. So he also had no idea how much improvement the blonde genin had been making during that period. Of course, that was in chakra control alone, but that was still his worst area. But, when he had actual instruction instead of being ignored or ridiculed, the boy shone, accelerating at an amazing pace, so those extra tips were making a big difference, even though they seemed small to Ebisu. The next day Naruto made a careful note to give to Hinata before he even left his apartment. In it, he explained that he didn't need to write anything down to pass the test, so not to worry. Spamming the world with Naruto clones, the lad was able to spot Hinata before she entered the building, and the real one ran up to her and shouting, "Here!" shoved the note into her hands. He stood there grinning, sure this would solve everything, until his expression faltered. His grin slipped as he watched Hinata, holding the envelope with her name on it and staring at him, have all of the blood drain out of her face, tremble, then fall over backward in a faint. Kiba, her teammate, caught her. What happened to her? Naruto pointed, already panicking as Kiba scowled up at him. Stupid. Sakura hit him on the back of his head. She fainted. You go right up to a shy girl that's got a crush on you and give her a love note in front of everybody, and that's what happens. Love note. Crush. Naruto tried anxiously to process those words. As he rubbed his head. Then he broke out into a wide grin. You mean she likes me? Like a boyfriend? Duh. Sakura hit him again, annoyed at this display of stupidity. Don't play dumb on me. Why else would you give a love note to her? It's not like anyone else would do anything but laugh at you. She's got to be the only girl on this planet that would go out with you. She's had a crush on you since we were all in the academy together. Don't tell me you never noticed. Kiba, by now, had looked away, hiding his anger at Sakura's words. But Naruto was glowing like the sun with a big, toothy grin. That was, until Hinata stirred a second later, whereupon she opened the note with a shy look of eager joy on her face, only to be crushed moments later when she read it. Naruto himself felt like the worst sort of heel imaginable as he saw her disappointment upon realizing that it wasn't a love note after all. Kiba helped her up, and the glare he gave Naruto as he helped the broken girl past spoke of his anger at Uzumaki for causing all this. Things then got worse as Hinata started to cry, sparing the boy she loved in vain one last pain-filled glance before rushing off to find privacy, the non-love note still clutched in a crumpled ball to her chest as she ran off. Naruto was left feeling like all of those villagers, glares of hatred had been right all along. He stood there, shoulders slumped, feeling like the worst sort of scum in the universe, all of his previous good feelings coming to crash down and burn on top of him. Sakura stood with him for a time, actually feeling some empathy, until Sasuke came to drag them all in. Hinata's team didn't come in to take the test, and Naruto almost didn't care when Sakura gave up on the 10th question again. Ebisu had him practice some refinements to his water walking this time. Hinata had offered to help him, a thing few people had ever offered to do. He could count those who had on one hand and still have fingers left over. That alone put her in a very special category. She was a precious person automatically because of that attempt. He'd very carelessly ignored it before, but stuck in his face day after day. It was no longer something he could avoid paying attention to, even by accident. Now Sakura was saying that Hinata loved him, or at least liked him in a boy and girl kind of a way. Naruto had no idea how to respond to that. He had no idea how to start, even. He supposed he could write her an actual love note the next time, to make up for the hurt of this one, but here the boy had to admit to himself that he had no idea what one of those would actually say. He'd never seen one before. Of course, he was Naruto. Tact, what is tact? Uzumaki. So he did what no one else was likely to do, and approached her directly the next day, before the test, and declared, "Oi, Hinata-chan, I was going to write you a love note, but have no idea what they should say. Any idea what I should put in it?" The poor Hyuga maid collapsed in an instant, blushing faint, and the crowds of collected genin broke out laughing. Baka. Naruto went down to twin thumps on the head from Sakura and Ino, who, after scolding him for being so tactless, dragged him off and gave him some basic, tips on the proper way to approach girls. It was the first time he'd had any information on courtship whatsoever, and it surprised him no end how very detailed was the subject. "Hey, that's more complex than our academy lessons," he objected, once they'd fully overloaded him with suggestions in their enthusiasm to correct his crudity. "Just do it," the two girls shouted, shoving him forward toward the Hyuga heiress, who by now had woken up and was being helped to her feet by Kiba. Hinata-chan," Naruto stuttered, coming to a stop before her and rubbing the back of his head, not looking directly at her. "Would you like to go eat with me, after the test?" Softly glowing a rosy pearl color, Hinata blushed and nodded, not trusting her voice, rubbing her fingers together all the while. Kiba just snorted at this display. This time the two genin teams walked together to the exam room, and Lee never made his attack on Sasuke. Slightly puzzled about that, Naruto got a new idea just as Kabuto was showing those ninja information cards of his, and asked, "Hey, what do those cards say about Hinata-chan?" The silver-haired genin gave him a sly look, and a glance over to Hinata, who was blushing up a storm, but the shinobi easily found their cards with the appropriate info. This is interesting. It looks like our little Hinata is heiress to the Hyuga clan, the most prestigious in Konoha after the Uchiha massacre. And what is this? She was the subject of a kidnapping attempt when she was only 6 years old. The hidden village of Cloud tried to abduct her for her bloodline. Decent skill at the gentle fist style, and a surprising number of successful missions for a newly minted genin of her age. Naruto's eyes were round as he looked over at the girl he'd always dismissed before, who was currently shrinking in on herself over all of the attention. This time they passed the test beautifully. Hinata was so embarrassed by the attention and the way her Naruto-kun was looking at her, that she did not press it when he turned down her offer of help. Then, Naruto was feeling confident enough to shout down the instructor, as he'd done the first time, so Sakura-chan did not disqualify their team. It was after that part of the test was over, Enko had come and gone and Hinata had left with her team, promising to meet him in an hour for lunch, that Naruto had an idea. Hinata worried so much about him that they'd failed time and time again from her offering to help him. So he ought to do something about that, and there, right beside him, was her completed test answer sheet. So, sliding it over, he began to copy it onto his. The test was already over, and they'd all passed anyway. He didn't care about score or anything. No, this was his sneaky plan. By memorizing her answers, he could have something to write down the next day. That way she would not be so concerned about him passing. He chuckled darkly until it was time for him to leave to go out to meet her for lunch. Naruto generally had one goal in mind when food was placed before him, and that was to satisfy his hunger. Consuming mass quantities was the goal, and doing so as quickly as possible, a habit he had picked up in his youth because of older kids who routinely stole his food. So he ate what he could get, as fast as he could get it, as a reflexive measure against that happening. But it was more than a little horrifying to Kunoichi with refined and delicate table manners. Even Sakura, who had tagged along with Ino and a few other curious Kunoichi to see this first date, and who could be called refined and delicate only in comparison to a gorilla, found herself appalled by the way Naruto ate. And she was not seeing it up close for the first time. Hinata, on the other hand, was, and although she'd been looking forward to this date for as long as she could remember, was a bit pained and winced at the animalistic manner in which Naruto consumed his lunch. Fortunately, he raised his food-covered muzzle to ask Hinata why she wasn't eating and caught her look of horrified chagrin. She tried to hide it, smiling weakly and picking up a morsel of her own meal, but her dismay was plain. That was when Ino and Sakura decided to intervene, and both together leapt in and dragged him away. For a quick, yet thorough, scolding about proper table manners, ending with, "The way you eat reflects on how you feel about those around you. If you eat like an animal, you're saying that no one around you is worth being nice to. So eat like a gentleman, or else she'll think that she isn't important to you." Shoving him back at the table, Naruto tried to remember the information surge and pluck out the bits he needed to finish his meal. Hinata was nice about it, and plainly grateful that he cared enough to try and be better for the remainder of their meal together, but just as plainly he'd already ruined her dream date for her. She left the table with polite thanks but unhappy looks, leaving Naruto alone to once again feel like a positive schmuck for upsetting her, especially as he was trying to be nice and make her feel better over an incident she could no longer recall, where he'd first screwed up with that note thing. Now his resolve only crystallized and grew stronger. He would make it up to Hinata. Both for the note misunderstanding, and for ruining this date. The rest of that day passed rather unproductively. The old man wouldn't give him a letter to Ebisu, because he hadn't failed the Chunin exam yet and so didn't need to be cheered up. When he sought out Ebisu on his own, the special Jonin wouldn't teach him anything. So, frustrated, he went back to the Hokage and asked how you learned to eat so you didn't hurt a Kunoichi's feelings. Sarutobi was so surprised by the question he actually laughed out loud. Then he had to have a full explanation, of course. At the end of which, merrily smoking his pipe, the Hokage had suggested that if he wanted to learn how to impress a Kunoichi, one of the best instructors for that they had was Kurenai, Hinata's Jonin instructor. He even wrote Naruto another letter of introduction. The boy bounced merrily away to go find the Jonin, which took a long time, but when he did she was a little unhappy with him, making him suspect she knew about his badly failed date with Hinata-chan. Still, she agreed to teach him all the same, but while the blonde did his best to absorb what she said, the lecture Kurenai gave him was all way above his head, relying on him already understanding basic stuff he'd never heard of, and sounding about as complex as rocket science. It made the Jonin-level shadow clone technique seem about as complicated as a line drawn in the sand. What did it matter what clothes he wore? Or how he smelled? He smelled just fine, thank you, having already bathed today. Breath mints. Flowers. What did those matter? Still, she said it was important, and the Hokage said she knew this subject better than anyone he had to teach him. It all seemed rather odd to him, though. But the worst part was she'd loaded him with so many specifics when he had no idea of even the most simple basics. Stuff like how to smile and comport himself. He had no idea how to smile, he just did. And all the stuff about fancy restaurants. He'd never been inside of a fancy restaurant in his life. They'd never let him in. He'd taken Hinata out to eat ramen at his favorite stand, just like he ate all of the time. No, the talk with Kurenai only multiplied his confusion, and Naruto went to bed a very unhappy boy. The next day found him up and already at the testing center before he realized that he was the only one there. None of the other Chunin hopefuls had shown up at all, which blew his mind as he'd grown to expect it. He waited for an hour before a hot-headed Sakura came back to scream and shout at him for not having been at the Forest of Death on time for their team to enter, and losing them their place in that test. Sasuke was even angrier with him than before, and Kakashi gave him that same, "I'm disappointed, you should never have been allowed to graduate," lecture. Confused and miserable, Naruto made his way over to talk to the Hokage, got a note to see Ebisu, and spent the rest of that day practicing chakra control. The next day, he was up and all packed and ready to go to the Forest of Death, only to have Sakura seek him out a couple of hours later to shriek at him about missing their chance to take the written test. Sasuke came to try and beat him up later, and Kakashi gave the same speech over again. Then it was back to chakra control with Ebisu. The next day, early in the morning, Naruto spammed clones all over Konoha to find out where everyone was gathering, and met them all at the exams center for the written test once again, same as always. So why had that one morning been at the Forest of Death? The orange-clad Uzumaki was very used to dealing with life by the seat of his pants, reacting to things as they came at him and living a life free of worries or concerns about trivial issues like tact and timing. Well, guess what? That all came to a screeching halt as he discovered he was trapped in a time loop. It's difficult if not impossible for a person to have an unplanned reaction to something he knows is going to happen. Especially when it happens the same way over, and over, and over again. Impulsive reactions don't happen anymore in that case. Recklessly charging ahead filled with passion only worked when you could feel passion over something. Having seen the same thing happen countless times kinda took the bite out of it, and knowing that however it turned out made no difference in the morning make reckless fury and passion almost non-existent no matter how willing you were to summon them. No, it was the sort of situation that demanded carefully thought out plans. When this happens I'll do that and see what happens, was the least of the strategies that could be employed to learn from the situation. Far more valuable was deciding what goal you wanted to pursue, then going for it. Being caught in a situation where careful memorization and planning made the only difference was both torture for Naruto, and the best thing that could possibly happen to him, forcing him to put his disused mind to work and at the same time training him to effectively use the demon container was, by sheer trial and error, learning the scientific method by simple, practical experience. I want this to happen, and I believe that it would result from my doing that. No. Well, then maybe this other. It had taken him several attempts, but he had successfully memorized the answers for the written portion of the Chunin test. Now Hinata no longer worried about him failing. No, now he had to worry about something worse. Every time they got through the test she'd ask him how he did it, admitting that she, herself, had to rely on her bloodline technique to spy out someone else's answers. Every time he came up with a lie about how he'd spied them out himself, she'd grow excited and ask for more details, and always grew so disappointed when his clumsy structure of lies collapsed and revealed he'd been fibbing. Telling the truth was almost worse. If he told her how he'd memorized the answers, she'd ask how he knew them beforehand, then he'd be stuck either in another haphazard structure of lies she'd uncover through interested and eager questions, or a truth that she would not believe, one that made her feel he was not only lying but trying to hide something from her. Either way, his clumsy attempts at explanations hurt her. Hurting Hinata made Naruto feel terrible. The more time he spent with her, the more he realized how important he was to her, and the more of a cad to shatter her illusions of him. So, in desperation, having freshly come from a branch of one of those conversations where Sakura had been boasting over how she'd solved it all herself, without cheating, as a way of pointing out to their teams how much smarter she was than Naruto, before immediately asking Sasuke for a date, the blonde genin had gone off to find Iruka. On locating his old teacher, the boy had shoved the test paper in his face and demanded, "Show me how to answer these problems." Chuckling, his old academy instructor did so, starting at the very beginning and leading Naruto through step by step, and confusing him to death not 10 seconds into the explanation. Seeing that, they started over. Naruto's brain hurt, and he was concentrating as hard as he knew how. The lessons took forever, going over the most basic parts of the easiest problem repeatedly, but slowly how it all worked began to take root. The next day, he was boasting to Hinata that he'd solved them himself, only for her to confess, shyly, that she'd only answered them by cheating, then asking him for help in understanding them. After floundering around for a bit, he went back to Iruka so that he'd look less of a fool to Hinata. And, well, the more he knew the more she asked and the more he had to bug Iruka to help him understand them, until Naruto had the ability to pass that test without having memorized the answers. A good thing for him was he had all of the time in the world to get it right. A bad thing for his immediate plans was that Iruka was a teacher, and as such he had no intention whatsoever of taking any shortcuts. He was not out to train anyone to solve only one problem, He was out to get them to have the concepts down, so they could solve any and all like them, and in some cases know the history and background behind them, which led into all sorts of closely related issues which had to be discussed in detail. So in spite of himself, Naruto was finally picking up some portion of an official shinobi education. Soon those conversations with Hinata were growing so long Sakura was overhearing them, and hearing Naruto talk about those subjects like he knew anything about them first got met by disbelief, so she pressed him, and when he could answer successfully he impressed her. Naruto liked impressing Sakura, and nothing he'd ever done before had done it. He also found it impressed Iruka and Hinata, too. Unfortunately for him, he liked it so much he couldn't help but lunge ahead for more, so did some extra studying just to have verbal ammo for impressing them further. Only this backfired from the start, as each tried to test his knowledge of certain subjects he hadn't studied, just to determine the breadth of his surprising education, and he kept floundering as they kept hitting topics he hadn't studied yet. Once Sakura hit a subject he knew nothing about, she was smug, having validated her opinion of him as a moron, which he hated, but once Iruka found an area of ignorance he was disappointed in Naruto, which the boy also hated. And both were in the habit of testing topic after topic until they found something he didn't know about, not maliciously, just out of disbelief. You mean you actually know something? You were paying attention when we talking about, well then what about, etc., etc., etc. Having found something they never supposed Naruto's hidden knowledge, they kept probing to find the ends of it, and naturally he kept expanding it as they came up with questions concerning things he didn't understand. Naruto liked impressing people, and didn't get to do it nearly often enough. Soon he found that the more he knew the more he impressed those three, triggering a near-endless cycle, as pretty soon Sakura and Hinata were expecting him to know things in the later parts of the exam. In the forest, his teammate would quip things like, "Oh, Naruto can find those. He was just telling me about the properties of certain mushrooms," and so forcing the boy to learn yet more. But that was getting just a wee bit ahead of our story. Not long after he had started to memorize the test answers, Naruto came up with why his endlessly repeating day had advanced to the forest of death that once. It was simple. Every time he passed the written test, the next day found his personal timeline actually advancing one day. On days when he failed any part of the Chunin exam, he'd wake up the next morning starting it all over at the beginning again. That much he was able to figure out, and it wasn't like it was easy to miss, since it started occurring regularly once he'd figured out the hurdles to pass to get by the written exam. From there it was an easy guess that to get out of this cycle, all he'd have to do was pass the Chunin exams in their entirety, and probably he'd have to do something about the invasion, too. The last was even more of a sticky problem than the first, and the first was no picnic by itself, either. It surprised him, going over it again and again, just how far he'd gotten the first time on sheer luck, when that luck was most definitely not going his way on any subsequent attempts. Any simple thing seemed to trip him up and get he and his team failed. Well, I don't suppose you could call being killed by Orochimaru simple, but when they entered the forest, it almost invariably happened that one of them would get killed by that amazing missing ninja. Naruto, quite frankly, had no idea how they'd gotten by the first time. It had all been done on impulses which he could not recall, so he was stuck trying to do it over again, and somehow he kept messing things up to where the snake Sannin would kill him, or kill Sakura, or kill Sasuke, or all of them. Waking up after dying was a shock the once, but after that it quickly grew fairly routine. You did it frequently in battle with a legendary missing ninja. After having been stuck in a day-and-a-half loop for what felt like months, the blonde demon container had to admit at last that nothing he did seemed to be able to get he and his team by the amazing snake guy with his hickey of death. It didn't matter if he fought, tried to evade the Sannin or spammed the world with clones disguised as his team and raced toward the tower, one of his team would always die, and it was usually him, which sucked. So it was time to consider other options. Naruto's usual approach to his day had settled into something of a routine. In the morning of his first day he would ask Hinata out, and after the test they would go out to eat together, where several kunoichi would hang around and watch them, at first in disgust, but as he improved later in giggling glee. After lunch he would get himself scolded by Ino or Sakura on whatever he'd done wrong, until those two couldn't think of anything, and both girls had begun looking at him with their jaws hanging open. So he'd begun to ask questions of the other kunoichi present, until he was fairly sure those dates were going okay. Okay, however, was not enough. So after those meals he'd pester the Hokage to introduce him to Kurenai, whose lectures had started to make sense. It felt great to the genin to actually start to be able to get a handle on something. And though the restaurants progressed in quality, none of the ones that would let him in the door were very good. So for the moment he was stuck, without a good idea how to improve those, and Hinata-chan kept nervously fidgeting during those meals, anxiously watching their audience. It was something he'd have to work on, as he wanted those dates to go well. After his dates with Hinata, Naruto generally had a conversation where he impressed Haruka, Sakura or Hinata with his hidden knowledge, and then spent the rest of that day studying what they'd asked about that he didn't know yet. The next morning, they'd go to the Forest of Death, someone would get killed by Orochimaru, and he'd start all over again. On days when he wasn't the one dying, he'd often leave the forest and try to get someone to train him, but people were so upset over the news of Orochimaru's return and busy dealing with it that no one could spare him any time. After having exhausted all of the ways he could think of to escape or defeat the Snake Sannin, and coming up with nothing that worked, Naruto decided that a change was in order. And what change he used was based on one of the standard shinobi sayings he'd just recently memorized: know thy enemy and know thyself, and you need not fear 100 battles. Know thyself but not thy enemy, and the outcome is always in doubt. Know neither yourself nor your enemy, and defeat is certain. Well, Naruto figured he knew himself pretty well. After all, what was there to know? And he was the expert on him anyway. That made it pretty obvious what he had to learn. So, the next morning of the written test, he went into the test center as usual and shouted, "Oi! Kabuto! What do those nin cards say about Orochimaru?" The silver-haired genin blinked several times, as did his fellows, but withdrew the appropriate information card anyway. The legendary Snake Sannin of Konoha, now an S-rank missing ninja. One of the strongest ninja ever to live, he is Kage rank in most areas, but his specialty is ninjutsu, and his stated goal is to learn all of the ninja techniques in the world. I don't know much about why he was thrown out, or his missions, but his Jonin instructor was Sarutobi, our current Hokage, and his teammates were Jiraiya, the Toad Sannin, and Tsunade, the Slug Sannin. That's probably all we'll need to know if there are any questions about this historical figure. Huh, I didn't know the old pervert was a teammate of the tongue freak, Naruto mumbled, causing several of those around him to face flop. And I'd never heard of this slug lady. Do you think either of them could train me to beat up old Snake Face? Of course not. What are you thinking? They are the legendary 3 Sannin. You're nothing but a dead last. Don't ask such stupid questions. Sakura lost her temper to shriek at him, bonking him on the head for such presumption. Kabuto looked on with some amusement, folding away his nin cards. I don't think any of them would be willing to train you, Uzumaki. But supposedly, the 3 Sannin are fairly evenly balanced. According to what I've heard, at the time he left, Jiraiya could still beat Orochimaru if they fought, but his toad summons would be beaten by Orochimaru's snakes. Tsunade would have lost in a fight with him, but her slugs could beat the snake summons. So really, it would take 2 of them to beat the third. But it doesn't matter anyway. After Orochimaru left the village, the other 2 disappeared also. Huh. Naruto almost blurted out that the old guy was in town right now peeping on women's bathhouses. He knew, one of his clones had run into him one morning while searching for Hinata. He spent the next few days seeking out the old pervert, only the old guy was so reluctant to teach him anything that they spent the full day arguing about it and Naruto didn't learn anything. So, in desperation, Naruto began to fail the written test on purpose, flipping off the instructors, obviously copying off of others, and as that grew boring, he began to grow steadily more outrageous, climbing up on his desk, dropping his pants to moon the entire room with the test answers written on his bum for good measure, and at last, opting to follow a suggestion given by one of the girls who'd observed their dates, turning to Hinata and loudly suggesting, "Hey, Hinata-chan. Let's make out." After her stunned, rosy, shy and nearly silent exclamation of, "Hey, alright," he then proceeded to kiss her before the audience of genin, causing Sakura to rise up in her seat, face flushed and vein throbbing, to shout at him, "Naruto! Don't do that here." Then her jaw dropped as Naruto did so anyway. It wasn't a very good kiss, but Hinata started to enjoy it. When the pink-haired demoness started to shout for them to stop it, however, Team 7 got thrown out. Naruto's purposes in flubbing the test deliberately were easy enough to describe. The first was to get in some sparring with Sasuke, who'd try to hurt him for having failed so deliberately, and learning to predict and evade those blows was always interesting until he got upset enough to turn his Sharingan on. But mostly he did it because, when he failed the test, Sarutobi gave him a letter to give to Ebisu, who'd teach him something. The special Jonin wasn't on a level with the Sannin, but neither was Naruto, and the blonde boy was just getting sick and tired of asking the old pervert for help, only to be snubbed in reply. The old guy wouldn't even let him sign the Toad Scroll again, and without that Naruto couldn't summon any. He was so angry he'd forgotten how he'd convinced the old guy to teach him in the first place, by adopting his sexy technique to turn into a pretty girl and ask nicely. So he was left with Ebisu, who was clearly second-rate by comparison, but still much better than training on his own. So he filled his afternoons and evenings with training under Ebisu, even going so far as to not walk somewhere if he could run on the walls, and floating a leaf above his head while others were talking, just to fill in the corners and take advantage of all the spare moments during his dull repeating life. Naruto had long since lost count of the days, he'd not paid any attention to counting them in the beginning anyway. But he guessed it was on the order of a couple months or so before Ebisu pronounced his chakra control decent, almost average. It is not your worst flaw, which is not what I was expecting given what I'd been told, and proceeded to teach him something else. The blonde genin got all excited at that moment, but what Ebisu taught turned out to be the basic clone technique, not refinements to the shadow clone, but the ordinary academy-level ninja technique everybody had to learn. The boy groaned, but persevered. By now Naruto had discovered through hard experience that the easiest way around an obstacle was sometimes through it. It was just easier to learn a basic something than it was to argue in favor of getting something cool and useful, because he could either spend a whole day arguing, and learn nothing, or just grit his teeth and learn it, then the next time prove he knew it so he could learn something else instead. That cycle had happened several times during his chakra control training. True to form, Ebisu wouldn't teach him anything else until he had the basic clone technique mastered, and then refined up to a level where it was almost impressive. At first Naruto hated spending time on his worst technique when he could have been doing something useful instead, and only put up with it because that was the only way he'd found to get the special Jonin who was his teacher to move on. But after a while Ebisu explained how a smart ninja could use both together. A shadow clone was solid but vanished after the first hit, while normal clones, being just illusions, couldn't do much of anything but take hits. And they wouldn't vanish when struck, so could take blow after blow if you could trick an enemy into wasting that much attention on them. So if he was just going to use them for target practice, or as distractions to draw fire, which was, admittedly, most of what Naruto'd already used, clones for ordinary clones had a place, especially if he mixed ordinary and shadow clones into a bunch, so an enemy couldn't know which were solid, and could hurt them, as opposed to those that were mere illusions and couldn't be disrupted by something so simple as a blow, but could otherwise be ignored. So the shadow clones would last longer if they were mixed in and among the ordinary clones, not granting an enemy a clear idea of which to strike in order to take out the dangerous ones. Thus, between them, they'd cost an enemy more time and effort dealing with the distraction. Convinced of the utility of this strategy, Naruto practiced and practiced until he could perform both ordinary and shadow clone techniques so close to each other they appeared in the same puffs of smoke, and with illusionary ones mixed among solids until there was no way of telling which was which. Ebisu even pronounced it a potentially effective battle strategy, capable of being a useful deception, sowing confusion as well as causing damage. The next time he tested this against Orochimaru it was true, but pointless, because as soon as the snake Sannin realized that was what he was facing, he threw a massive, wide-area jutsu that destroyed everything around them, and in the process killed all of the clones and Sakura, once again causing their team to fail. Carrying Sakura's broken, bloody body out of the forest of death, for he forgot how many times had kind of dulled the blonde's reaction to it. They took her to the Konoha morgue, and the blonde genin had the appropriate forms and paperwork filled out to inform her family and so on even before the door had finished swinging shut behind them. They were, it must be admitted, far from the first or only genin team there. Seeing as how the morgue was attached to Konoha's general hospital, they had all of the usual around-town accidents to take care of, training accidents from newly minted genin all of the way up to a young and foolish Jonin who nearly burned her own face off, through chronic ailments like that Hayate guy's coughs, and the expected serious injuries and deaths caused by the rather extreme second test of the Chunin exam. It was a busy place, and Naruto was out of there before Sasuke had even sat down on a convenient bench to wait for them put the girl's body into a cooler for later autopsy. Uzumaki, on the other hand, knew he'd be seeing her again tomorrow. Oh, he'd cried for her once, twice, he forgot how many times, even hugged her the next day until she'd smacked him, but she died so often in those fights it just didn't affect him anymore. He'd died more often than she did, anyway, and she didn't get worked up over it the next day. Of course, she didn't remember it, but his emotions did not care about that. Emotions never do. No, he had stuff to do. Sakura was dead, which meant his team had failed. The times it was Sasuke's body in there, he'd stick around to comfort Sakura, which was probably the only time she'd let him hug her without beating him for it, but since it was Sakura, the Uchiha would just go on brooding as usual. Though, to be honest, it was maybe at a slightly more intense rate. At least she hadn't choked to death on her own blood this time. Those were always horrible, especially the look in her eyes as it happened. And it always made him feel so guilty, every time she looked so surprised that he wasn't reacting more strongly to her grisly demise. Shuddering at those memories, Naruto skipped along toward his destination, a place he had been many times, but only just begun to appreciate, the Konoha Public Library. Under disguise, of course. They'd never let him in otherwise. They had information on Orochimaru there. Oh, none of the classified stuff, but the publicly available information, which included all of the stuff Kabuto had said about him, plus some other facts and details. Things like the names of his old students. Mizuki was one big surprise there. Naruto knew he'd been a traitor since he'd tricked him into stealing the Scroll of Forbidden Seals. Another name had been blotted out of the one book on the Snake Sanin's genin team Naruto had been able to find. But the last was still around. Old Snake Face had left his one-time apprentice in town, a special jonin by the name of Anko Mitarashi, the very same Anko who was proctor for the second test of the Chunin exam. It was amazing what you could read from books. Creating hundreds of shadow clones, the kid began to look for her. Luckily for him, he was early enough she had not yet been informed of Orochimaru's return to town, and so he found her outside of the forest of death eating dango, and throwing the empty sticks to a tree where they embedded in the symbol for Konoha, a leaf. Rushing up to face her, Naruto pointed a finger at the woman and shouted, "I need you to train me." Anko actually chuckled. "Oh, failed already? I guess you do need training. But why do I need to be the one to train you, Breathing heavily from his run, Naruto panted, "If you do, I'll dedicate my life to defeating Orochimaru." At this the special jonin actually quirked a brow in interest. Oh, she rolled the idea around some in her mind, concluding it could actually be useful to have some help when she went after the old bastard. So she smirked, "Okay, kid, you've got my interest. Tell me what you know already. We'll see where we go from there." Still panting from his long run, the boy nodded and declared, "Body switch, clone, transformation, sexy, shadow clone, and harem techniques." Abruptly the special jonin's interest turned to amazed disgust. "That's it. How the blank did you even get in the Chunin exams? Forget it, kid. You'd never survive an encounter with the old bastard. Come back when you're older, and at least be sure to have some useful techniques next time. I already survived one fight with him earlier today." The boy shouted, but this had the opposite effect than intended, getting her to abruptly demand where, then rush off to search for her old master herself. None of his arguments swayed her, not even when he had a repeat of this same encounter before entering the forest, and without mentioning her old teacher. Sadly disappointed, Naruto again started flubbing tests on purpose to go back to Ebisu, who so far had been the only teacher he could count on. Well, there was also Kurenai, but he could still hardly understand what she was saying half of the time, and he didn't understand how anything she said was going to help him defeat Orochimaru in any case. Not that he could afford to get better clothes than he had on, anyway, even if they did what she said they did about making girls like him more. How was that going to matter, anyway? So, getting another letter from Sarutobi, the demon container once again ventured over to where Ebisu would be, and once more submitted himself to the special Jonin's tests to gauge his present skill level. His spirit soared when, after submitting to the battery of demonstrations he required, the glasses-wearing special Jonin once more announced they'd be working on a technique. Then Naruto slammed his face into his palm when Ebisu decided that what he needed to do was bring to full mastery his offensively crude body switch, also known as the replacement technique. Thanks for your listening. I do hope you enjoy. If you guys enjoyed and you want the next part of this video, like, subscribe, and comment down below and turn on the bell notifications. And also check out the other videos that I have created and enjoy. See you in the next video. Peace.